We are currently also streamed online on YouTube. So if anyone on YouTube wishes to make a question, you can write it down in the chat. And we collect questions also in the chat. But for this roundtable, we have 1 hour and a half. I have prepared questions for you. Dr. Zuiderent-Jerak, Dr. Ivo Pollini, Ivo Quaranta, and Dr. Alessandro Pollini, so sorry. So ideally, we will go through the questions, and then if we have time, maybe 20 minutes left, we can open for the discussions. But you are here, and you are the protagonist of the roundtable, so you have the privilege. So, Dr. Zuiderent-Jerak has been already presented, and now we have also Dr. Ivo Quaranta, who is an associate professor in cultural anthropology and ethnology at the University of Bologna. He works within the field of medical anthropology and anthropology of the body and disease. His research activity is devoted to the analysis of the cultural elaboration of and social production of illness experience with regards to migrants and healthcare. In his research, such analysis constitute the ground on which action research activities are realized within the healthcare system, trying to combine forms of intervention capable of taking into account both the role of cultural differences and the impact of socioeconomic inequalities. With Chiara, he coordinates activities of the Center for Studies and Research in International and Intercultural Health in Bologna. In Italian is Centro Studi e Ricerche in Salute Internazionale e Interculturale. And Dr. Alessandro Pollini, he's senior researcher in industrial design, Faculty of Psychology, International Telematic University, Nettuno. He's an interaction designer and cognitive ergonomics expert. He's experienced both in R&D and product design projects. He has been postdoc researcher at the University of Siena and researcher in cognitive psychology, human-computer interaction, and learning technologies. And since 2019, Nettuno is project coordinator of the Horizon 2020 project Rebuild, which researches and promotes development of ICT-based solutions aiming at enhancing the efficiency level in local authorities' service provision and the immigrants' quality of life, aiming at focusing on the lack of bridging between public services and actual possibility of accessing them for immigrants and refugees. So you have very different background, and we wish to build a bridge, a rich discussion, and please don't be shy in the discussion. And I would start with the first question. I would like to follow the following order. Ivo Quaranta first, Alessandro Pollini second, and Teun Zuiderent-Jerak third. So my first question is, how would you define interaction in your research? Is it intervention? Is it participation? Is it something else? And which tradition does your framing appeal to? So please, you are invited to discuss and to compare also your perspective among yourself. So Dr. Ivo Quaranta, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chiara. Good morning to everybody. First of all, let me express my gratitude for Teun's beautiful keynote. It was really thought-provoking and deeply inspiring. And I come, as Chiara said, from a different background, and therefore I probably belong to STS studies, according to your joke. Well, as Chiara said, I presently director of an interdisciplinary center, research center, where social cultural anthropologists, sociologists, economists, psychologists, and public health experts work together. And we work really on the relationship between socioeconomic inequalities and health, but also on how to translate the results of our research into transformative practices. Not only in terms of redesigning healthcare services, but also transformative practices at the grassroots level, making people really resources for their own health promotion. And this is probably the best starting point to somehow express the tradition I somehow locate my work in. That is that of the collective health perspective. We know how we have public health perspective in the mainstream biomedical setting. And we also have another critical perspective pretty much framed around the paradigm of the social determinants of health that looks therefore at health and illness as indicators of our relationship with socioeconomic and political dynamics. This is already quite a critical perspective with regards to the public health one that is mainly somehow focused on how to provide service for collective groups and bodies somehow. What do we mean by collective health? That it's a perspective pretty much based in the Brazilian tradition, but it's actually coming from social medicine and the Italian tradition of social medicine. Collective health is a perspective that looks certainly on the one hand at the habitual determinants, social, cultural and economic determinants of health, but at the same time, look at health as something that must be promoted by really empowering people, creating the possibility for allowing people to negotiate the terms of their existence. This immediately implies a specific, somehow, definition of participation. And this leads me to the kind of work we do as a research center. In our context, really, participation is crucial, not just as a value, but really in practical terms. Let me be somehow very schematic if you want. In our understanding, health should be seen as a cultural construct. That is, has to do with what gives meaning to people's life. And of course, we are all ready to claim that the best way to deal with a disease is probably to take it to the attention of a medical service, yet health is something that cannot be brought to the attention of a medical service. Health is somehow produced by focusing on the daily social condition of our existence. And it has to do with what really constitutes the set of habitual relationships with the world we are engaged in. And therefore, if you really focus on health promotion, you must consider health as a cultural construct, as something that has to do with what gives meaning to people's life. And the only way to somehow have access to what gives meaning to people's life is actually to interact with them. And therefore, proximity is really the ground at the methodological level for any work related to health promotion, unless you want really to do something different. And of course, I'm not going to talk about the critical understanding of public health intervention as normative intervention that somehow reduce people to population. The idea within the paradigm of collective health is actually to subjectivize people in terms of resources and not in terms of a population. In this framework, participation is really a key ingredient, not to have access to people's perspective about their own health. Participation is the ingredient because it is only through participation that we can actually can co-produce, co-construct what means health for the people we are working with. You know, all of us are not somehow aware of how knowledgeable we are, simply because we live through implicit meanings. Our work should be that of making explicit what is actually implicit. And of course, a participatory approach, pretty much rooted in a phenomenological appreciation of ethnography, is the best way to engage with people in creating the condition for them to explore their own ideas in the interaction with the researchers. And therefore, the work we do cannot be seen in terms of collecting data. It's actually a way by which, through proximity, you co-construct, you co-produce, and understanding of reality. You co-produce what gives meaning to people's life within the specific actual circumstances of their social existence. And of course, this links quite well with what Teun was saying before in terms of giving somehow recognition to other forms of knowledges to be taken into account if your aim is actually that of working for health promotion. And during the first phase of the COVID-19 pandemic, our research center was engaged by the municipality of Bologna to somehow help them to understand which lessons should be taken into consideration in the future preparedness. And we immediately signaled them the need to really ground in medical and social services within a view of health as a cultural construct that requires participation in order to define people's needs. And this leads us to the second definition of participation. Health and social needs, health and social services shouldn't be seen as providers of services. They should be actually seen as a way by which you create the condition for people to actually participate. Another aspect that was crucial during the pandemic was the resilience of specific territories to the pandemic. And in analyzing what was happening in the municipality of Bologna, for instance, the area that emerged as more resilient were those in which there was a high level of community involvement and participation that was clearly there before the pandemic started. Yet, the health and social services were all talking about community participation, as if communities were already there, as if communities are natural entities existing in the municipality or in the town. And of course, as a social-cultural anthropologist, I know quite well how communities actually are forms of relatedness, are really symbolic constructions. If you really want to gear your healthcare and social services around the issue of community participation, first of all, you must engage in the very process of producing communities. And participation in this sense is really the way by which you actually engage in processes of community building. It's impossible to somehow summon communities to participate if there are no communities there. And of course, again, participation is really the means by which you can engage in promoting the very process of constituting communities according to what gives sense to their forms of relatedness. And this is clearly a way by which you transform what is defined as non-institutional in something that is redefined as a public good. That is, the institutional services, in order to promote health, try to make public what is usually not considered as a resource for the services, because the habitual services are all framed around the institutional. The idea here is to bring in the informal within the institutional around the idea of a public that is composed by the institutional and by the non-institutional. And of course, this, I think, makes sense within the framework that Teun presented us when he clearly says that intervention is not simply related to taking sides, but is probably related to the ability of changing implicit assumptions, in creating possibilities for alternative ways of thinking. And clearly, the idea of reorganizing our healthcare services around the idea of community participation, both as a way by which you are actually granting the right to meaning, are granting people the right to define their own best interest and somehow ask the institutional services to provide the resources in order to create those forms of community involvement capable of transforming people's life. And this is the last comment I would like to make in order to somehow answer Chiara's question. And it's pretty much related to the issue of transformation. If we really want to focus on health promotion, and clearly by health, we mean something that is not the opposite of illness, but we are really trying to completely demedicalize the concept of health, then of course, you should consider health as a cultural construct, but such a cultural construct must be socially produced. And of course, the best actors in this process of production are actually people themselves. So institutional services should actually create the condition by which people can promote their own well-being. And in these terms, I would define the way in which we combine research with participation and with intervention. In the sense that clearly participation is the ingredient by which proximity can produce and co-produce data. And of course, if the only way to produce data is by getting involved, you are inevitably part of the reality you are working about. And therefore, you are inevitably producing some kind of intervention in that reality. And of course, if by granting people the right to meaning, and these meanings are somehow acknowledged and recognized within the institutional settings, you are also producing alternative way of defining priorities. You are making explicit what is usually implicit. You are clearly producing the possibility for transformation. Well, this is probably the easiest way to summarize what it means to me, intervention, participation, and action in a way that in some terms can relate to what Teun has been discussing about. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivo. Thank you very much. Really interesting and dense. And I would switch to Alessandro Pollini. And do you need, Alessandro, that I make the question again?
No, no, Chiara, it is clear. And first of all, thank you for the invitation. Hope to provide my contribution to this discussion and to this very challenging but also intriguing seminar. No, I like very much, since as an interaction designer, I deal with the material stances of our reality. And sometimes it's very useful for me and for us as a category, I would say, to reflect upon the broader relations between human experience and technologies and science. So it's very a pleasure for me to stay here. I have also in the past, also coming to your joke, also in the past touched some SPS conferences, so it's very nice to remember those opportunities. And of course, interaction is very relevant for me as an interaction designer, since I study human-machine and human-computer interactions, which is my background. And of course, with a specific purpose, which is not exactly and not only building knowledge, but specifically define and configure interfaces for technologies. So how people could enter into the relation with technologies at very different levels and in a very variety of domains, you know, so from industrial domain to digital services and to digital and interactive artifacts in general. And of course, there has been many insights in what you were saying about Teun and Ivo also, since of course, as a designer, I need to work in the situated action. So not only the situated by manipulating the situated knowledge, but with the focus on the situated action, in principle, starting from a proper cognitive approach, since my background is both on design and cognitive ergonomics. So it's the internal process also very relevant to me, which allow which allow people to, of course, process all the knowledge in the situated experience. But not only as an internal process, but also as a social practice. No, that's why I'm so passionate about this reflection. And the interaction is in my activity is the situated experience to come into contact with interactive technologies and artifacts, So within, as Ivo was saying, established organization, but also established communities. So since our action being situated is not me alone in the laboratory, but it's the real life, and it's within a community. And all this was also the experience in the Rebuild project, which Chiara was mentioning, which is about ICT enabling services, enabling experiences for migrants. And there in that project, but also in as a broader approach, interaction is both at methodological level and also production level, no? In a sense that as at the methodological level, interaction is, of course, as Ivo was saying, is my participation as a designer into the creative production processes of people, no? So it's me that need to interact with them, but it's also the object of the production, since I design the interaction. So it's very interesting, since while interacting with people, we do actually build interactions with technologies, So it's what in the STS is the configuration of the technology, so to say. And this has been also one of the core processes in the Rebuild project. As Chiara was saying, we have designed the interactions with both local service providers, so at the institutional level, as we said, but also with migrants, so with also marginalized people, and of course while practicing with different kind of approaches, since in part we needed to interact for a joint analysis of needs, motivations, expectations of people at both levels, but also, as I said, to co-create solutions. I liked a lot what Ivo was saying about the alternative futures. We worked a lot with people to envision alternative futures, alternative scenarios, to, of course, see how to transform reality, how to change really, and also with relation to your book, change it now, possibly, So while enacting this change in our society, in our communities, and of course, last point in this comment is about one of the main issues we are facing in the Rebuild project, which is actually how to remove the barriers to participation of migrants, in a sense that we are discovering, working with people, that there are of course, a variety of barriers of course, sometimes linguistic and cultural barriers, but also technological or functional functional literacy level, in a sense that sometimes we have some pragmatic and real-world barriers like lack of connectivity or no knowledge of interactive technologies, or no knowledge of a computer laptop, since many of our users are an extensive experience with mobile phones, but not with the concept of a computer, of a computational artifact. So it was very, so to say, common ground experience. This, and this is kind of the basic level to remove all the barriers to allow them to participate in those sessions, both in the analysis and in the co-creation activities. And literacy was a key. Since we're discovering many kind of literacy issues. So at functional level, technological level, cultural level, of course. So this was really an important issue to broaden this space for marginalized people, to broaden this space, to open this space, to start the dialogue. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. So I would leave the floor to Teun to comment and answer my questions. And you are really different backgrounds behind your studies, and I wish to know more about your opinion, Teun.
Yes, I mean, it's funny because I haven't realized yet that the Groucho Marx jokes, of course, also works the other way around. Now nobody can claim they're not part of this anymore. So it's nice how you both, by saying you have different backgrounds, actually positioned yourself within the field of STS. I hadn't realized it had that effect as well. Thanks for that. Yeah. So what about interaction? I think it is, as obviously, I mean, it's not a cheap answer. It's many different things, depending also on different audiences. I mean, within the field of STS, I care about in its diversity, including the fantastic analytical work that I take a lot of inspiration from and need to be connected to. I mostly position this as method. So interaction in its different forms through interventions is ways to come to, as Ian Hacking calls it, uncontentious realism. Realism that's based on the ability to change the world. That only works with the philosophy, with some of the philosophically inclined within STS. I also know that Ian Hacking was once not invited as an anchor teacher for the Dutch STS graduate school program because that was not STS. I mean, of course, there's all these different division lines, and it's about how to mobilize it to build a connection. I think it's experiment. And it's a way to turn STS lessons onto STS work regarding nonlinearity, regarding sensitivity to world making. And this is where I also very much resonate with both the other members of this roundtable in terms of that interest in the experimental. And it partly also depends on the type of issue or the type of question I'm trying to relate to. So I really appreciated the proximity you highlighted, Ivo. And I found that proximity is also really important when working with guideline developers. Their lived realities and lived experiences and serious concerns up to the level of being emotionally frustrated about some of the huge communication mess ups around, for example, AstraZeneca in the Dutch context, is equally about the cultural production of health. And one that for me is importantly does not exclude medical outcomes, although those always need to be contestable as well. So I think the fact that they discuss in quite some detail the clinical studies is very important for their definition of health. And it is also very important to the definition of health by many others. Of course, this is part of the STS critique on medical sociology, that it left out clinical outcomes. Stefan Timmermans and others have written about that. And of course, this is, if it's a cultural construct, it doesn't mean that then excludes outcomes, right? Those are part of our lived experience for sure. So how to include those in a way that then also leaves space for different understandings and different enactments of health, but without becoming sentimental about which versions are better. This is one of my concerns, although I very much resonate with the enthusiasm with which you speak and also the content with which you speak about this need to perform communities and design our methods in such a way that we perform communities, while at the same time also remaining very empirical about at what moments that actually produces problems, for whom, in which way. And that's where the Becker notion of avoiding sentimentality, I'm not even sure what exactly he meant with it, but this is where I really like to think about. So yes, we have that commitment, and this is obviously, it would be very strange to claim you don't have it. Also the fields you're both working in, actually, I mean, it would, or where the whole ERC project now is connected to. I mean, it would be very strange to say that these are not topics you deeply care about. But I've also tried to mobilize what I thought was the knowledge of nurses that was rendered functionally invisible in clinical practices, to then find out that these particular nurses were not particularly skillful at the level of care they were given for this group of patients, which was very circumstantial. That's not a judgment about them, but this was a day treatment center for oncology patients, and many of the nurses who worked there because it means they could pick up the children from school on time. They didn't have to work weekends. And this was quite different than the nursing work I was mostly familiar with through the work of people like Lee Starr and many others, where it was the work that was made invisible was really important, and it was a lot of value in making sure it wasn't rendered invisible, or there was at least, when I encounter such a different politics of marginalization, when I encounter that patients do not necessarily have have understandings that contribute also to good outcomes on the medical level, I do take that as a way to challenge this attachment and to see what can I learn from this. What can I also learn about the assumptions in notions like invisible work? Is there a certain romanticism in it that all invisible work is skillful invisible work, or are there also unskillful practices of invisible work? And what do we need to do with that conceptually? So at the same time, I'm also working on the topic of the digital exclusions through a project I joined a bit later that's very participatory in nature, and that is really about the health consequences of people with migration backgrounds of the digitalization of health. And combining that with really working with those communities or make those communities also in that process to learn what kind of issues are being experienced, but also take that to designers, to IT designers, and find out how design could change to do that. So I think I tend to like this notion of not hiding the commitments I have, but putting them at risk, because the chances are you learn something not only selfishly, but also to do something different than what others are already doing in those fields. So I think all of that falls under this question, but I'll stop here.
Thank you. So today we also want to discuss the role of social scientists, and this discussion is about this topic, not only your work and your perspective, but also the role as social scientists. So I would like to push you to tell us more about which forms, in your opinion, which forms of intervention are more suitable to achieve fair and just enactment of populations. And I'm asking you to address this issue also with concrete examples from your experience, from your research as social scientists, in order to make us understand and like touch your research. And again, I would leave to Ivo also if he wishes to continue discuss after Teun, and then Pollini, and then Teun again.
Thank you very much, Chiara, and clearly thanks to Alessandro and Teun for the ongoing conversation. I'm really enjoying it. And well, I would love to actually also comment what Alessandro and Teun just said, but let's try to do it by answering your question, Chiara. Well, what kind of contribution can we give as social scientists? I think that we can start from where Teun just stopped when he said that we end up doing things differently, really. I think that what our contribution can be about is really related to the possibility of somehow making explicit the implicit by showing people, for instance, the role of human agency in what they consider as natural. I've been working quite a lot with on the relationship with between healthcare and migration, and I've been supporting healthcare services in addressing migrants' health problems. And I worked a lot side by side with them in somehow showing how very often what was missing in the medical encounter was the explicit thematization of, first of all, recognizing people their right to meaning. Doctors in trying to do what they believe was the best interest of their patient would constantly skip the crucial issue of engaging them and involving them in defining what their best interest was about. Probably those doctors were right, because they had seen already many cases similar to that one. But clearly, if you do not engage people in producing those meanings, you are actually skipping the level of experience that is actually the lived ground of transformation. And of course, if you do so, you end up somehow creating a situation that is not producing the transformation you are hoping for. And simply by somehow using that kind of approach that show how through the level of proximity, somehow the process and not just the product. And therefore, if you really want to take care of somebody, you first of all have to co-construct a definition of the problem. And those doctors learn how to reflect in self-critical terms about the fact that in their habitual relationship with patients, with whom they would share at the implicit level cultural assumptions, there was always a co-construction going on. There was no need to make it explicit because it was already happening. Whereas in dealing, for instance, with migrant patients, that process of co-construction didn't necessarily happen because of cultural differences, because of the lack of an implicit common ground. And therefore, that co-construction has to be thematized in explicit terms. So by really focusing on the practices by which somehow our giveness is constantly produced, we actually allow actors to become aware of the role of human agency. And by so doing, you actually create possibility for actors to become really the main players of their own transformation. In that case, I'm referring to, we were working in a university hospital, and the best way somehow to take care of migrant patients' health needs was actually to transform doctors in making them aware of the practices that were constituted at the implicit level, the work of care. They were exceptionally knowledgeable, but yet they never had access to those forms of knowledge that could allow them to reflect on the implicit making of what they consider as a natural given. So I really think that our contribution can be defined in terms of somehow creating the condition for self-reflection, and by so doing, making people the main players of their own transformation. And of course, in this way, you can see that it's not just somehow an issue related to being with the underdog. Probably sometimes the best way to take care of the underdog is probably to transform the condition within which their claims are actually learned, assisted, or met, or unmet. So sometimes you really have to shift grounds and mix up things in order to get to the point. Well, there are certainly many other issues that can be said about it. Just let me give you another very quick example, since Chiara asked for them. During the work we did last summer with the municipality of Bologna in somehow identifying those crucial lessons to be taken into consideration in somehow restarting life. First of all, we really stress the idea that we shouldn't consider the political aim in terms of going back to normality. If by normality we mean a situation with which COVID-19 could become a pandemic, because of many different factors that all call into question the role of human agency. So if there is a lesson to be learned, is actually how can we imagine a new form of normality out of this experience, collective experience. And of course, what we did was to somehow create the condition by which also institutional policy could be seen in cultural terms as way by which a specific image of society was produced, performed, and somehow implemented. And take into consideration the issue of preparedness, for instance. Between the first and the second wave of COVID-19, all countries were storing medical equipment, were storing chirurgical masks and disinfectant and all the tests needed for testing COVID-19 and so on and so forth. And at the conceptual level, nobody was actually considering preparedness in terms of what actually creates situational resilience. And as I was telling you before, just by speaking to the municipality of Bologna, it was quite clear how resilient was the kind of mutual support that at the grassroots level emerged during the most critical moment of the lockdown exactly 1 year ago. And yet, in conceiving of preparedness, nobody considered the community work as part of a plan for future preparedness. So again, creating the condition for considering issues that are usually out of your frame of reference, because clearly, even the issue of preparedness was highly conditioned by specific forms of knowledge that were granted official recognition at the social level. And of course, our work was somehow not to dismiss those forms of knowledge, but to show clearly the implicit limit to the explicit forms of knowledge that should be considered as legitimate source of information in orienting policies. And of course, this can be done not by somehow aiming at criticizing the establishment, but rather can be done through showing in what ways those alternative ways of conceiving of reality can actually empower agency, can produce a wider field for action. And clearly, there is no opposition between life science, social science, but we can actually work together in highly productive terms. And yeah.
Thank you, Ivo. I don't wish to give an order, but if any one of you, like Teun, wants to react, or Alessandro, my idea was to propose an order, but do you want to react? Are you free to do that? Okay. So Alessandro, thank you.
Yeah, I go on these last words from Ivo, since of course even in my own experience, the work is to be done together to understand especially complex socio-technical issues, and there is always the need to work together with social scientists, of course, especially for disentangling the individual, but also the social and collective experience, you know. So since I feel that with different lenses, the proper experience, you know, could be approached. So somehow at the individual level, or on internal and cognitive processes, but rather on social and collective experiences. And I feel that in all social science, cognition, technology, and design scholars are all together responsible for this in-depth and in-context analysis, no, of all the experiential realms, in a sense. And especially when the artifacts we are designing together, or the solutions we are thinking about, are so to say having an high level of also intelligent, you know? So not only interactive artifacts, but also intelligent artifacts. And there, I always had the need to build this knowledge base for the design, you know, since you need to go together in preparing or creating the conditions, you know, for this work. And in the especially in our co-design work and process in the Rebuild project, we found out the proper need to understand migrants' interests in being cooperative. So we needed really to focus on the real opportunity for them to cooperate, you know, since it's not given for granted, it's not free, it's an engagement which is based on also their own interest, their own motivation, no? Since otherwise it's always sort of unbalanced relation, no? Where they claim for their needs, but they also expose themselves to with their own vulnerabilities, no? So and this in this perspective, participation also of social scientists for us was really useful to prepare those conditions, you know, to reason about a flexible way of meeting them, agile method to engage them in co-creation situation, in situation activities, since for us was in principle or theoretically possible to propose a design workshop or co-design workshop. But when you are with people from Zaragoza or other areas of our cities of Bologna, you can behave a certain way. When you are in front of marginalized people, you need to understand really the conditions, what's the quality of this co-design approach, how we can modulate this approach to let them participate, since also so to say, in my experience, also this hierarchy, that is always undergoing, where you are the researcher and they are the tester or the, so to say, users, But here. And here I always meet what Ivo was saying about also making or working on implicit assumptions, since it's very, very important also in our perspective, since if you work on those implicit assumptions also with respect to cooperation, to being cooperative, and this is very important. Otherwise, this co-creation and co-production of solution is always, so to say, a Western attitude to foster solution for disadvantages or to marginalized. So in my experience working together with social scientists is very helpful to set these kind of issues and to solve these kind of sometimes oversimplification, since sometimes we incur the risk to oversimplify those complex group of people, where you have in front of you, of course, a broad variety of people, maybe already in the integration process with some ambitions of integrating, rather than people who are newly arrived, maybe in some of irregular situations. So there are really so many different situations, and at least in the design perspective, we always risks to came out with one solution, but one solution cannot fits all, fits all the needs, fits all the experiences or expectations. So this is very, very relevant for us.
Thank you, Alessandro. Teun, what are your thoughts?
Yes. Yes, thanks. What would I have to add to all this? I think maybe I would rephrase the question slightly from sort of what should we aim as our roles, or what is the role? I think actually this is where I tend to empiricize again, because we don't take roles. There's a lot of people who already have roles and who are like, we may aspire to a certain role or may resist a certain role, and at the same time we're being ascribed certain roles, and at the same time sometimes our role is an effect. I mean, I think after I had done a project to develop what I called situated standardization in an oncology ward, really trying to work in a very sort of collaborative intervention practice of changing the practices at that ward. I came later, after I had written the final report to sum it up to the higher management of that hospital, and I spoke to one of the doctor's assistants, and she said, well, I read your report, and it sounds like a lot of really interesting things happened, but I don't experience it. Nothing changed for me. And I started to look more closely into it. And as it turned out, one of the things I'd said from the beginning is that if we want to change this world, people here are addicted to working hard, and there were huge status differences between the physicians and the nurses and doctors' assistants, especially doctors' assistants. And the doctors' assistants were not so excited about working hard. They had slightly different, they didn't mind working hard, but they had slightly different professional identities. And as it turned out, and I realized that, and I said, all the space we will create at this ward to make sure that we can organize it around patient trajectories, it's going to get consumed by busyness. So we should make sure there's no growth in the influx of patients unless there's a real clinical need. This was a tertiary line oncology ward, so university hospital. And they said, yes, of course, that's very important and all that. But as it turned out, in the meantime, without me being much aware, they had started these new clinics on new specialties. I think Ivo just dropped out. I hope he will be back. They started up these new clinics with new specialties. And what I had become was a logistics manager who had done optimization to the advantage of the medical professors in that hospital who could run extra clinics to some extent. This is sort of putting it maybe a bit more rough. There were some other advantages as well for the patient trajectories and the working experience of those doctor assistants, but it's not, we don't take roles. In this case, I ended up having a role as an effect that I really had not aspired to. So I think the most important thing is to empiricize our roles, because this is also a way how we get to know our fields. The roles we are ascribed. This was actually the topic of the first journal article I wrote, because it was so vivid. It was so clear that these roles were being ascribed. I was having these impossible expectations put on me, and this is and the roles we can take are deeply gendered. They're based on age, academic positions, and obviously these are challenges for more junior scholars who are often put in extremely laden settings with the nice flag of intervention. And this is all the stuff. Apparently this is the now of STS, so I guess I should then also be doing it right now. And I take mostly the inspiration there from anthropologists who've argued that stress is inherent to fieldwork, so we better use it as part of our repertoire, and it's especially inherent to intervention-oriented fieldwork because of all the claims that come with it. So, and in situated intervention, I wrote about that in terms of sort of loyalties and betrayals in relation to those roles. In a way, quite often we end up being some kind of loyal cheats, but we're also being cheated. We're also being mobilized to all of a sudden be an expert on something we didn't feel comfortable about. So, and I also quite like to experiment with these roles. I mean, I've also authored papers and reports that follow an IMRAD structure because I want to speak to a medical community for whom this is. And actually, in the chapter in the Making and Doing book, I've kept one of the IMRAD abstracts as part of the narrative, because to show that you have to be also, if I want to speak to that community, I have to adopt some of their communication forms. So mostly empiricize, and it's a risky practice, which means you better take it very serious. And of course, we can be aspirational about the roles we should be taking. And I'm not saying I'm not, but I'm also aware that that's often not where I end up.
Okay, thank you very much. Since it's time is running out, actually, and I'm awfully sorry to say that. Yeah, I'm really happy about this discussion. I'm really happy to see that we are actually breaking boundaries, redefining boundaries, but breaking boundaries between social research and social action. And we have been talking about your kind of experience and research and your ideas about social scientists' roles and hopefully concrete examples. And I wish to open now the floor to questions and answers and allow people in the chat to raise their hands and make questions, and so that we don't delay too much with our schedule. And so there is already a question from Professor Evelyn Rupert, and I would leave the floor to her. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Chiara, and thank you so much to the organizers and also the speakers today. This has been a really fascinating discussion. I wanted to pick up on really a great point you just made, Teun, in my opinion, about the role of the social scientist as an effect, and perhaps as effects. And I think you're saying that it's a shifting kind of role that one cannot necessarily predetermine in advance. And it made me also think of a question that really troubles me about other kinds of effects, or what hacking also calls subversive effects of knowledge practices. In that way, he was talking about how producing knowledge can also come to produce the very subject and object that knowledge, seeks to know. And he called that in some ways a subversive effect. And I wanted to think about that, especially in relation to the discussions we've been having about participation, empowerment, co-production, co-creation, all these sort of different words, and the kinds of what we could call governing effects of those forms of what people are talking about in terms of engagement. I think there was some language, for example, of resilience, preparedness, especially in relation to health. One could also think about those as forms of responsibilization, in that when we engage with people, we engage them as being reflexive beings who consider their own health needs. I think has been expressed really well by Ivo. And in turn, we have them as key participants, not only in speaking of their own lived experience, but also how we incite or provoke them also to be part of the very management of the body, especially as we think about the pandemic currently, and to take responsibility for that and in terms of their engagement. So I wanted to have a little bit of reflection perhaps on those kinds of effects and how, as researchers and social scientists, we might think about that as a possible role empirically, as Teun has pointed out, to reflect on, but also in terms of sort of a sub-question of this, if you can indulge me for one more moment, Chiara, and that's about questions of difference and friction of those very subjects we engage with. The talk of communities is really important, but we also know they are other forms of vague wholes. And I love that phrase again. I think that came from Teun's keynote. How does one also acknowledge and respect, those frictions and differences, whether it's a migrant community or a community in Bologna or anywhere else, that they are also fraught with huge differences, power struggles and dynamics and difference. And I think it can easily happen that this kind of gets smoothed over, and to think we can find the voice of communities in relation to health or any other topic. So kind of a provocation, kind of a question, kind of a comment, but thanks again.
Thank you very much for this interesting question and provocation. So who wants to go first? Teun.
Oh, I was just touching my chin, but but I also would. I think it's a really interesting. It's a really interesting puzzle, and it's something I've come across also very much in relation to working on these notions of digital exclusion, where it all of a sudden became very uncomfortable. Why are we hosting these participatory design sessions with women with mostly Moroccan migration background in certain parts of Amsterdam, whereas this is hardly their problem. Digital exclusion. I mean, the COVID-19 tracking app that was designed, its first design only worked from iPhone 7 and up. So, why am I having participatory sessions with people? Whereas actually, so of course, some of the things we did, which was actually sort of interesting, we interviewed designers of portals. And we noticed that to find out how did they speak about these kind of marginalized communities, people living in conditions of vulnerability, etc. And we found that actually they use diffusion theory to justify dealing with that later. So while we're all, and I think this is beautifully captured in I think a paper by Paul Dorish, Implications for Design. While SDS and human-computer interaction, etc., have become really good at working on sort of small pilot kind of projects, doing some design with a certain community. Meanwhile, computer sciences, large parts of those educations, and the companies building these are full on into Rogers, and we're doing this detailed theoretical purification of using the right term and there's a problem there, I think, indeed, of responsibilization for a problem that may really need to be addressed somewhere else. I mean, my other example has, and I think especially also the socioeconomic position in relation to COVID mortality rates. That really needs to be addressed somewhere else. Where I would like it to be addressed is in the prioritization programs that the Ministry of Health and the Dutch Health Council are setting. I think if you have double the mortality risk, that's a very good reason to be prioritized in the vaccination strategy. Especially if you know that those are people who are less likely to get vaccinated anyway. That you would have a lot of focus on that. I'm not sure responsibilization would need to work in that direction. I would rather see it in this case work towards other actors. Well, yeah. So thanks for the provocation. I'll think more.
Thank you, Alessandro and Ivo.
Well, very quickly, thank you very much, Evelyn, for your points. If I got them right, I'll give you just two examples. When we were working in the university hospital, in supporting doctors in attending migrant patient needs, what eventually happened was that doctors were somehow engaged in a severe explicit conflict towards the hospital administration because they were not given enough time to actually perform their duties in taking proper care, first of all, by granting the right to meaning, creating a proper relationship as a ground to actually produce better care. So our implication that reality created somehow a condition of conflict. And when we talk of participation, of engagement, as Teun said, we should avoid sentimentality. We are not in control of what can actually happen. And of course, there is not a safe standard according to which you know that what you're doing is right in itself or not. The only ground to actually end up evaluating in one way or another what is coming out is by asking yourself questions. What is being produced? By whom? In whose interest? At whose benefit? At whose expenses? And by answering this question, you may position yourself in one way or another, or at least you make explicit a process by which you can claim the reasons why you believe it's a proper position, the one you are actually try to take side with. Whereas in the support to the municipality of Bologna for the future preparedness, what came out was quite clear that the institutional politics was quite ready to implement participation if that meant a better way to map the population needs, was less ready to open up to participation when they had to give up their habitual form of governance. and again, conflict is part of our work, because it's quite clear that it makes all the difference if you create context by which participation becomes actually a form by which politics is played out. This implies that you haven't got a central governing body, that this will be diffused in the different neighborhoods, where you will have to have some local articulation, very much proximate to the actual social and living condition. So it's a completely change of paradigm. And again, what is being produced, by whom, at whose expenses, are all questions by answering which you can end up claiming a proper position somehow. And clearly conflict is, I wouldn't say inevitable part of our work, but it's certainly an ingredient of it. You must always take it into consideration. And I don't believe that it must be somehow searched for, but at the same time, it shouldn't be avoided.
Thank you. Alessandro, do you have any reaction?
Yeah, just a comment. Thank you, Evelyn, for this comment and all the discussion. Is I want to came to the part you were mentioning about this power troubles or power or hierarchy and so on, and I was thinking that practically speaking, also in our project, we found also another thing that was really useful and here in this discussion, which was the impact and the role of intermediating facilitators, so to say, so between in this play of roles, in this play of power, in reality there was a crucial role of mediators, the crucial roles of cultural mediators rather than social mediators. And if on one hand we found, as Ivo was saying, with service providers and professionals, this kind of openness or high level availability to interact and to participate and changing things in dealing with migrants. Also, there was this role also by adding complexity to this picture of mediators who were implied and involved to fill this gap, this distance between the different roles, and was very very helpful to enacting communication, to prepare the context of the dialogue, but also to enacting the communication, and was interesting also to reflect with them about alternative roles and alternative ownership of the solutions of the futures we were building together.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. Do we have time for a last question? Yeah.
If there are other from...
There are no... okay, so a question from Annalisa Pelizza.
Okay. Question for Alessandro. And then a reflection for Teun and Ivo. So Alessandro, my question to you is, when you work with migrants, you talk about this learning experience, especially from them. So, but where do you find, or when do you find their own knowledge? So where are the moments that opens up that you can find your own knowledge and see it fully articulated? So that's very useful also for us at Process Citizenship, because we are in a process of creating knowledge or stimulating knowledge production with people who went through registration. And therefore, that's a very, let's say, practical, operative question. Can you identify moments when they provide or they reflect on their own knowledge, when or where? And then my to Ivo and Teun. So Ivo, I was wondering, and it's really an open question, when you talk about the changing role of the institutions as not providers but facilitators, aren't we, and it's really an open question, but aren't we risking to buy into the neoliberalist, let's say, deregulation framework, where the state is not responsible for providing services anymore, and let's say individuals are made responsible for themselves? Of course, I know that you're not talking about individuals, but the communities, and that might be the difference. And therefore, the reflection for both Ivo and Teun, isn't that some differences that we have spotted in your understanding of interactivity? Can it be the case that it has to be with let's say, an ostensive or performative epistemology? And explain myself. For Ivo, you were quite clear in defining between communities and institutions ex ante, as if they are so in an ostensive epistemology. So we know who are the institutions, we can define who are the communities, or we can create the communities, but at least we can define who are the institutions, and therefore we try to engage them through, but we know at least who are the institutions. What I notice in turn, it's a more probably granular definition of institutions. So Teun mentioned some differences in a working culture between nurses, doctor assistants, doctors, and therefore maybe that's a more performative epistemology or empirical way of defining ex post who are the actors.
Okay, thank you, Annalisa, for this question. I first start very briefly. Don't want to take time for the others, but just practically speaking, we were of course leveraging upon materials. Leveraging upon artifacts, interactive artifacts and prototypes that are used into workshop-like session, no? So to say that while proposing materials or concept or representation, no? In this open discussion, we could, of course, on one hand, we are orienting, no? We are guiding the discussion, since we make a proposal, a foundational proposal. But at the same time, we allow people and migrants to elicit their knowledge or their expectation and to extend and change those these solutions. So, okay, of course, there is one moment, one specific moment when we go for observing, doing field and observation, participant observation, but the proper way of and the proper moment is when we foster and put in front of them an artifact with certain qualities, interactive qualities, to center around this artifact, you know, the experience or the service or the novel situation we want to propose to them. So, and that is really an value for building new knowledge or to reshaping their knowledge of or their experience. So.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, I go so that we leave Teun the last word. Thank you very much, Annalisa. Well, you are right. I'm not actually in favor of a kind of neoliberal kind of reframing of our public services. Quite the opposite, clear. The point is really to somehow create a condition in which participation can actually be the means by which as care and social services can be reframed. Clearly, we also need to reimagine what kind of knowledge are socially legitimate for this kind of services, what kind of professionals are supposed to work there, and it's really a way to reframe the entire system. That is, let's start from actually how people define their needs. Then you will clearly see what kind of services you have to somehow create, what kind of professionals or forms of knowledge are needed in order to make those services function properly. And who is going to somehow train these professionals at the university level? So rather than having the situation in which now you have universities that define what is the proper knowledge social servants rather than medical doctors or nurses should be trained with, then they end up working in services where they need other types of competencies and knowledges that were not provided by their training, and therefore they have to relearn again on the field what is the best way to actually perform their own work, and discover that they are standardizing somehow through their service provision people needs, so much so that unless they are capable of framing people needs within the services they can provide, there's no other way to meet those needs. So it's a way to really reverse this entire process. And of course, the resistance will be massive somehow, because you really are going to undermine established roles and somehow situation or relations of power. Imagine how the university system would be somehow challenged by this kind of approach. But as we've seen with the Evelyn question, clearly you are also touching upon an established way of performing governance that is not easy to dismantle. And concerning the definition ex ante and ex post of community and institutional, yes, I must say that concerning my talk today, you are certainly right, even though having worked for many years on biomedicine in terms of the practical analysis of experiences, not just of patients, but of doctors as well. Clearly, I feel much more granular in my definition, much more than I actually presented today, in which I did somehow put one against each other, institution and communities. But I would leave the floor to Teun to conclude. Thank you very much, Annalisa.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I mean, everyone for the very interesting talk, and also Annalisa for your question. I think partly again it's a matter of proximity, as Ivo mentioned it, but then extending that to all communities, including communities that make institutions and their infrastructures and all that. And partly it's a matter of it's a question of strategy. I mean, I've quoted Steve Brown a lot. I'll do it once more now. He has this nice paper in which he says that if we very often end up organizing an away match. It's like we say this is an institution, or this is evidence-based medicine, or this is, and then we position ourselves outside of it, a bit like the Groucho Marx thing, but this time it's something we critique. We don't even want to be part of it from the beginning. And of course, what is the response going to be? Like, it's not going to be inviting, because we're not exploring the frictions within and the differences within. So and I noticed just in the way after your question, the way I spoke about the Ministry of Health or the Health Council, there's no proximity in the way I think about them or speak about them, because those are not currently part of the project. It's something we're exploring whether they should be, because they're so important in the prioritization. So the empiricizing it is and the proximity part is to make those institutions, to allow them for the diversity that they can have. So to sort of enact them as frictuous, as spaces in which a lot of stuff happens. And then also to not exclude ourselves from those practices and those frictions within, to connect to what I've called STS sensibilities. I mean, if STS took their sensibilities from the field, it shouldn't be a surprise that we find those within the field without the difficult linguistic formulations. So who are the people that resonate with those, even if they use quite different terms, and how to connect to those. So I think that would be indeed, I like to take that kind of granular notion, also because of the possibilities that allows to take them serious in their normative intent, and also not to make them more unified, that then makes it inactionable. I don't know how that works in border control. I mean, it's a fantastic. I mean, I'm looking so much forward to hearing more about where, for example, the Ontology Explorer is going to lead, what kind of connections that allows you to build, and all of that. But yeah.
Thank you. Excellent. So I will close here if no other questions come up, but I don't see anything. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. This was a really interesting and dense discussion. Thank you, Dr. Teun Zuiderent-Jerak, Dr. Ivo Pollini, and Dr. Alessandro Pollini. Ivo Quaranta, I'm so sorry. That's my low sugar level that's speaking.
Don't worry, Chiara.
Thank you a lot. Thank you for your patience. And we have a lunch break now, and we wish to come back at 2 p.m. sharp with the panel, our second panel of the conference on interventions and their methods, which will be chaired by Lorenzo Olivieri, and we have the pleasure to have Chiara as discussant. And we thank you all again for your presence, and we see each other at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.